Hey, my name's Adam Chung and I'm the pastor of Cross and Crown in Melbourne, and you're listening to a Reach Australia podcast focused on cross-cultural ministry. If we want to think about reaching Australia with the gospel, we also want to be able to reach all tribes, nations and tongues in this country with the gospel as well. And today we're joined by Eugene Hor, who's the lead pastor of Grace Point Presbyterian Church here in Sydney, and also an adjunct lecturer in preaching at Christ College as well. Eugene, so good to have you here.
Pleasure.
And we also have Iggy Wong from CPE Church up in Brisbane. Iggy, it's great to have you here as well.
Thanks, Adam.
We're talking about Asian Australian ministry largely, but it can be overly simplistic, I think, sometimes to say, well, I guess all Asians look the same, don't they? We're all the same, no matter where we live. You've been pastoring a church that's largely Asian Australian, but do you want to tell us about some of the complexities that might be within that when we double click on that term?
Look, I've been the pastor of Grace Point for about 20 years. So we're a church plant. And I think when we planted 20 odd years ago, it was predominantly with the Australian-born Chinese university student group. I mean, the church is now made up of a whole range of people, from children, students, to 50-year-olds, mums, dad, parents, 85-year-olds. So it's fairly large, but we're still predominantly Australian-born Chinese or Australian-raised Chinese. So that's the church that I'm involved in. We do have Chinese speaking congregations. I'm not the pastor of those congregations, but we work in partnership with them. So we've also got Cantonese speaking congregations, Mandarin speaking congregations. So it looks Chinese, but it's fairly diverse because, as you know, it's not just all Asians do look the same, but they do come out of different cultural backgrounds.
It's funny, isn't it? Because if you go on the website or the Facebook page and you look at the photo, you think, well, it must be a homogenous unit. Everyone's exactly the same.
Correct.
But it's not that simple.
But it's not. Because, I mean, so one example I often give is, even if you think of the Mandarin-speaking congregation, most of our Mandarin speakers, most of them are from mainland China. And some of your hearers might be aware that mainland Chinese Mandarin speakers are different from Taiwanese-born Mandarin speakers. In our Cantonese congregation, most of them are actually from Hong Kong. But obviously, if you're Hong Kong Cantonese from Singapore and Malaysia, that would be culturally different as well. And it's the same with our English-speaking congregation. Not all ABCs are the same. So I'm Australian raised. So I'm the son of a migrant family. My children are actually ABCs. They're actually born here. And they're not children of migrant family. And so they would be different. But we've also got people in our church who are Vietnamese. Who are children who are born here, but who are children of parents who fled persecution, and they would be different as well because they used to live in the Cabramatta area and then they've moved here. But we've also got kids who are parents who come out of the North Shore, eastern suburbs, and that's different as well because they are a lot more middle class in their background. So it's quite diverse culturally.
And there's the funny thing, right? Because we often, even when you mentioned that, we might think, okay, there's different groups of Asians, but maybe the worst kept secret, there can also be conflict within and among those groups, can't there?
Absolutely.
I mean, in my old church, at the height of some of the tensions politically, it was actually quite difficult between some of the mainland Chinese and the Taiwanese.
Oh, yeah,
Taiwanese,
absolutely.
Or more recently between Hong Kong Chinese and the mainland Chinese.
Right.
So how has that played out in Grace Point?
I mean, I think we're quite fortunate at Grace Point because I think our Chinese-speaking congregations actually haven't let politics get in the way. But, occasionally, I don't even know whether I can say this on the podcast, but on the odd occasion, I'll speak to to someone from Hong Kong, and then they'll say something privately to me about, how bad the Chinese government is, and then I'll speak to someone from the Mandarin congregation, and they'll talk about how it's so bad, these riots, because it's a usurping of authority. And so people have different opinions, but I think in a church like ours, we've worked very hard not to let politics divide us. Why? Because I think in our church, we've made it clear that what unites us is the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. It's got to transcend politics. It's got to transcend culture as well. And even within the Chinese church, there are cultural differences, and people have to recognize that.
So is multiculturalism even within the Asian church, rather than just
so.
multiculturalism that's skin deep?
Correct. I think so. But people don't realize that because, I mean, they look at the three of us here, and they go, oh, 3 Asian guys. But Iggy, you're ABC, is that right?
I was born in Malaysia and I came when I was 3 years old.
Okay.
So essentially ABC culture, but
that's right.
Raised.
That's right. So you're ABC more than I am. I came when I was 15. And where are you from, Adam?
Surprisingly, ABC, but everyone thinks I was born in Malaysia. But I'm actually from here. So
yes, that's because I think we've, a lot of people, on the odd occasion notice when we speak to you, sometimes you'll bust out in your Malaysian, Singaporean
not bust out. I'll lapse.
Yes,
into
that's
it.
right.
That's right. But I've heard you as well, Eugene. So
only if I need to.
Only if you need to.
All things to all people, right? So we change the way we use our English. Yes, that's right. Contextualization.
Sometimes we're talking about Asian Australian ministry and the problems and the struggles that people have about going into ministry. Yeah. Is that always just an Asian Australian thing? I mean, it's very easy to go, it's because that's their culture.
Yeah. So
is there more to it than that?
That is fascinating, isn't it? Sometimes the myth is it's harder for people of Asian background to take the step into full-time Christian ministry or to do a ministry training apprenticeship or leave their careers. And more I'm thinking that's simply not true. I think it's just as hard for people who belong to any culture. I think that the challenge, for Asians going into ministry would be the same for any middle-class background person going into ministry. So it is interesting. Obviously, I've come out of a migrant family, and so my parents' objection to me going to ministry was because I think for them it would be a waste of the opportunities that they've sacrificed for me. But I don't think that'd be too different for a Caucasian family who are middle class as well. They've made sacrifices as well. So I think the challenges are there. I mean, obviously there are cultural nuances. If you've come out of a family that made incredibly huge sacrifices, it might be harder for you to actually, want your son or daughter to go into ministry. But I think it's true across all cultures. That's always going to be the challenge. Yeah.
How do you think that more individualistic Western viewpoint versus that community, family sort of Eastern sort of culture, do you think that plays into it?
I think there are cultural nuances. I mean, obviously, those of us who come out of Asian background, we are less individualistic. And so even if you're a second generation, what your family thinks is probably, I suspect, more important. So I suspect that's there. That would be a cultural nuance. But even in the West, I'd be hesitant to say that, if I came out of a Caucasian family, that my parents would be happy for me to do whatever I want.
Yeah.
So I think of parents who live in maybe the eastern suburbs of Sydney or the North Shore of Sydney. I think middle-class families always have high aspirations for their children, which is why they send them to the schools that they send them to. So I think they would have the same aspirations, but whether the second generation, whether Asian or Caucasian, how they respond, I suspect might be different. So I think in Western culture, we're probably more individualistic. But in Asian culture, even with second generation, I suspect we are a lot more filial. So what our families think, I suspect, we would take that on board a lot more. Yeah. And that's where the pressure comes, isn't it?
So it's funny, isn't it? Because sometimes what we nail as a cultural problem, there might be legitimate cultural issues there, particularly, as you said, from the second generation responding to the first generation. But sometimes it's an aspirational class matter.
Yes.
That there actually might be more consistency between a Caucasian aspirational middle-class person and an Asian person in the same class versus an Asian person who is working class from a refugee family.
Correct. Yeah.
So what would it look like, or what have you seen it look like from a working class background? How is that different?
Oh, that's a tough one because it's never simplistic, right? And that's the problem when we have these discussions. We always speak in extremes or we generalize too much. But if you've come out of a persecuted background, let's say a persecuted background, or you've made incredible sacrifices. So I think of one of our MTSs whose family fled Vietnam. They came on the boat. She was born on a boat. Obviously, for her to go into ministry, the challenges were a lot harder because she knows the sacrifices her family have made. And so you've got that pressure.
And she feels that obligation to
so there is an obligation to my parents have made these sacrifices for me. And here I am, I've done my university degree, I've climbed, as it were, the corporate ladder, and then I'm putting it all aside. So there is a sense of obligation to family. But I think that's a cultural thing. But that's the pressure as well. Now, I'm not saying the pressure is not there. I think if you're family or middle class, but I do think it's there. But I think the pressure is different for my children, because it's not like they look at us and go, "Oh, you guys have fled persecution, so we can have an education." Whereas our kids probably work really differently. Our kids are more like, "Oh, can I use your credit card?" Or here's a list of things I found on Amazon. Can you pick it up for me on your Prime account? So it's just, it's different.
And some of that, as you said, might be a cultural thing, but it might be the fact that actually you're the generation that actually benefited from your parents' sacrifice.
Absolutely.
And then they're the generation after that who benefit even more still.
That's right. And so subsequent generations might be A, B, C, but there's different cultural pressures that they experience.
So the impact of that migrant sort of mentality will be less and less as the generations go on.
Correct.
Yeah.
And their pressure is different. So I'll give you an example. The pressure for my children, I've not said to them, don't go into Christian ministry. But the pressure for them will be, life is good, and if I go into Christian ministry, I might miss out on the good life. Whereas for my generation, it's like, or for me, my parents have made sacrifices. If I go into Christian ministry, who will look after them? So it's different pressure.
Do you think then the risk is that we end up continuing to encourage the next generation of people going to ministry to enter Christian ministry, but on the assumption that they're us? So
I think that could be the danger.
Yeah, so we speak to them as if they occupy our position, but actually they're the next generation and they're in a very different class position. And we're speaking in one sense to ourselves, but to the wrong people.
Yes, that's right. So we've got to work out what sort of ABC or second generation are we talking about? Do they come from the eastern suburbs of Sydney? Here in Sydney, it's more of a middle class, upper class suburb. Do they come from the western regions of Sydney, which is more of a working class background? So who are we actually talking about? And it's not just true of ABCs, it's true of all cultures. Yeah.
So it may be the case, for example, that as migration from mainland China continues to come in, their children might face the challenges that we faced when we entered ministry, but the children of the third generation Singaporean Malaysian migrants,
be
the next generation, actually a totally different set of
totally
issues.
different. Yeah, totally different.
And those challenges are not uniquely Asian migrant challenges.
No.
They're just challenges of the upper middle class.
Of the upper middle class. That's right.
Yeah.
Do you think that's why, for example, when we think about an apprenticeship and the challenges and the cultural greatiness of an apprenticeship, it might not actually be a cultural thing, but it's actually, well, you should be university educated, go get an accounting degree, work in the Big Four. It's actually, it's an aspirational thing.
It's an aspirational thing, yeah. I mean, what are you going to get out of 2 years apprenticeship? You might as well go to university, get a degree, and then go into ministry after that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not productive. It's seen as producing something tangible at the end.
There's no accreditation
right.
from the government
maybe
at the end
maybe that's what you need to do, right? Have a accreditation.
Okay, so how actually do you think then we should go about ministry training when we think about that cultural perspective of a traineeship, for example, with zero accreditation, and at the end it's like, well, thank God a few churches in the country might think you're worthy to.
Well, I don't know, man, because I'm always happy to print like a certificate and say, yeah, you've graduated 2 years ministry apprenticeship in our church. That's right. And with a seal down the bottom as well.
You'll start peeling off
that's
after a few weeks.
Absolutely. You can get them at Office Works apparently. I don't know, Adam. I think that's a really challenging one because obviously when people do apprenticeship and they train for ministry, it's not a university accredited thing. And those of us in ministry will know that ministry is not just the acquisition of knowledge. It's also hands-on practical experience where that knowledge is actually synthesized under a mentor or a coach. And I think that's a very foreign thing. And Asian culture in, I suspect, any generation, because of our aspirations, we value higher education, the classroom. And I think that's the challenge with the upper middle class.
Yes, but Chinese people invented the exam historically. Like that's our contribution
that's
to the
right,
world.
Your contribution to the world. Yes, that's why, my kids are suffering because of that. Yeah.
Is that true, Adam?
It is true.
Okay,
I'm pretty sure that's
No,
historically.
I don't want to doubt
I'm
your
pretty sure that's historically
integrity.
accurate.
That's
That our one and only contribution to the world
Right.
was we created the exam. So
Yeah, he watched it on Horrible Histories.
Just on the topic of apprenticeships, just want to dig into, I guess, different learning styles also, which we haven't really talked about in terms of migrant culture. Traditionally in Asian culture, even now in many Southeast Asian countries, or not just Southeast Asia, but Asia in general, it's a very didactic sort of one-way learning. Here's the information, you download it. Whereas, and the concept of an apprenticeship is quite a foreign thing. So how do you think that's impacted the way that I guess Asians have taken to training? Do you think that's had much of an impact? Has it been difficult to adapt?
Not so much for us, Iggy, because our guys that come train with us, most of the people who train with us are raised within Grace Point. So I think, if for us, it's not like someone who we don't know. It's normally someone from within. They've gone through the leadership pathway, as it were. They've been involved in Sunday school. They've been involved in serving in the life of the church, so we know them. And now, obviously, people from Asian background, especially those who come from high aspiration families, which is almost every Asian background family, they tend to which is why they go to university, because it's an education, or at school they just learn, right? So I think it's in the mindset of most people, and certainly apprentices, we come and we study. But apprenticeship's not just about growing in conviction, knowledge of the Bible. It's also about growing competency. And alongside that, also growing in character as you do the work of ministry, the skills that you acquire. So for us at Grace Point, I think when we think of the training for people in ministry, it's really those three components coming together and making sure that they're well balanced. Now, obviously, every ministry apprentice is different. Some people are more geared to skills-based training, more tactile. Others are more geared to reading. And I think the challenge is always trying to balance the two. You don't want to go down one and then not have the other, because I think in ministry you do need those three things when we think of the training of people in ministry. I think now that you've asked me, I think as I reflect on apprentices we've had in the past, I think if I were going to say anything to someone who wants to train people for ministry, is actually working out what would work best for a ministry apprentice, and then tailor the training to them. So, people who are more academic, I suspect you don't have to actually tell them to read, because they'll do it. People who don't like spending as much time with people, well, maybe you need to push them to spend more time with people rather than spending time with the books. Yeah.
Yeah, so just adapting to what would best be helpful.
Yeah, I think you need
growth.
To do that for their growth.
Of course.
Yeah.
Do you tend to find in Grace Point that there's a particular priority on one versus others? So do you get more people who would value the academic side and in one sense look at that and say, well, if I'm theologically sound, then that is a good reason to go into ministry, maybe even if they are lacking in the other areas?
I think ministry training has changed in Grace Point over the years. I think now I think we push very hard to have a balance in all three. Cole Marshall used to say that those three C's that every ministry apprentice needs to work on, right? They need to work on their character. They need to work on their conviction, their knowledge of the Bible. They need to work on their competency and skills. And I think that'd be true of us as trainers in our church. We want all three. Now, obviously, we have to tailor to each individual that comes, because different people have got different levels of knowledge, different skills they need to acquire. And so I think that's how we've been doing it at Grace Point. Yeah. In
your context, either because of, as we said, culture or class, or maybe a mix of the two, what has it looked like for finances to be either a barrier or a facilitator for ministry training? Is it something that people go, well, I don't want to do it because either my parents think it's too low pay, or I'm thinking about getting married and therefore I want to provide for and prepare well for that. So what place do finances have when it comes to ministry training?
I think that's always the worry, isn't it? My parents, their great worry when I went into Christian ministry, I think one of their concerns was whether we would have enough to live on. I never did ministry apprenticeship, but I did Bible college at a time when there was no fee help. And so there were times when there was like $100 in the bank. We were married, we're living in Newtown. But the crazy part was we never starved. And when we planted the church, I was also $100 a week for the first year with 30 people, and we planted the church. But we never starved. And so money is always the concern and the worry. And it remains a concern and worry, I suspect, for ministry apprentices today, for church planters today. But God has always provided, you know. I think because we've raised in a culture that is so, you know, I think we're raised to be self-sufficient. And so we don't want to put ourselves into a position where either we're dependent on other people or whether we are forced to truly depend on God. Because it's so much easier to depend on God if I've got $15,000 put aside in the bank each year, set aside to do a ministry apprenticeship. But if I have nothing and I have to raise it, I have to do one or two things. I have to depend on people who will partner with me in the ministry of the gospel, and I've got to depend on God to provide for me so that I can actually do the apprenticeship or even plant the church. And so, you know, that's a challenge. It will always be a challenge.
I mean, I guess fundraising for ministry training is never anyone's favourite part of the job.
Yeah.
Do you think it's particularly grady is it particularly difficult for Asian Australians to fundraise?
Yeah, I think it is, because if you've been taught to be self-sufficient and to depend on no one, you know, to be independent, as it were, independent in achieving your goals and your ambitions in life, but always dependent on your parents because you're Asian, and always coming under their instruction and guidance, then it's hard to ask people for money. It's very hard, which is why one of my friends is a missionary, and when he wanted to go into ministry, his in-laws actually said to him, "You're a doctor. We want to support you doing Christian ministry, but what we think you should do is you should actually stay as a doctor, buy a house, set your family up, your children up, and after you've done all that, when you've retired, then you should go into Christian ministry, because then you'll be ready because you would have provided for your family." That's effectively the mindset and the mentality.
That's what's being said to me.
Well, there you go.
So I was having flashbacks as you were saying that. I thought you were my dad for a moment. It's particularly difficult, isn't it? Because actually you're right, with particularly the aspirational Asians, the jobs that they're quitting are as a lawyer in a top-tier firm, or an auditor in one of the big four.
That's right.
And then after that, you have to go from that to saying, please support me in this ministry traineeship fund.
That's right. And it's the, Bishop Gary Koo here in Sydney says it's the big three, right? The big three for Asians. Especially Asian mums and dads, is, doctor, lawyer, engineer, or maybe you can throw an accountant if maybe accounting.
Someone told me it was doctor, lawyer, or failure. So it was one of those three.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, if you get the third one, don't come home. And so it's true. If you've trained to be a doctor, or lawyer, engineer, accountant, or someone in a professional degree, and then suddenly to depend on others, I think for parents, that's also a measure of shame, because we've invested in you and you're asking people for money. You're begging. That's what you're doing. Yeah.
So from a church perspective then, is that either, how should we respond to that? Because I can imagine there's two general ways you can respond. You could say, okay, here's the financial challenge that's there. As a church, we're going to step in and step up to allay that in some sense.
Absolutely.
Or you could also take the total opposite Christ counterculture approach and go, well, this is an opportunity for discipleship, so suck it up and go fundraise. Is there somewhere in between that, or what's the right way?
Yeah, I actually think there is. I think so. One of the things we do with our ministry apprentices is we say to them, this is a growing opportunity for you to speak to individuals, because it's teaching you to depend on others to partner with you in the ministry of the gospel, which will go on for a lifelong ministry. It's also an opportunity for you to actually depend on God. So it's a discipleship lesson for the individual, but it's also a discipleship lesson for the church. And this is why I think that's where senior leadership needs to step up. You got to have conversations with people's parents. You got to explain to them that, your son or daughter isn't going to starve. They've got the support of the church family. You've got to actually see it as a discipleship opportunity for the church. And so at Grace Point, what we say is God's mission And raising the next generation of gospel workers is a community affair. It's not the individual, it involves us. And we see that from the New Testament. And so we have opportunity to partner with individuals in the gospel, and that is our privilege. It is a privilege for us to do that, and we partner in 3 ways. We partner in prayer, we partner in practical encouragement, and we partner in giving financially. And we've got to call people to do those 3 things. Yeah. So I think for us, that's the middle. Yeah, that's the middle ground.
As you think about Asian Australians whose parents are churched, the experience of a lot of pastors and ministry workers in migrant churches is quite different to a lot of the mainline established churches, if you're Sydney Anglican or Presbyterian or FIEC. Generally speaking, at some level, you're reasonably well looked after. Do you think that there are reasons, some Asian parents don't want their kids to go into ministry because of their experience of what pastors go through in migrant churches growing up?
I mean, I suspect if you're Anglican or you're Presbyterian, you're right. You're well supported. It's not like you're going to starve. Years ago, and I don't know whether it's true today because I work in Presbyterian ministry, but in a lot of the independent migrant churches, the myth was the mark of spirituality was poverty. Only true for the pastor, though, and those in ministry, not true of everyone else in the church. So if you want to go to ministry, then the mark of your spirituality is your poverty. And I remember Bishop Gary Koo actually saying, that's absolute rubbish, right? He would say that, the fact that we have migrant churches who think that the mark of a pastor's spirituality is his poverty is absolutely rubbish. The mark of poverty is poverty. That's what he used to say. And I think that could be true of some places. I would hope it's no longer true today. I think gospel workers, the New Testament actually encourages us and reminds us that a worker deserves his wage. Those who actually are preachers of the gospel should actually be supported. And I think we need to actually encourage that. I think that's really, really important to actually do. Now, obviously, that's a fear that migrant families have. If my son or daughter goes into ministry, he or she is going to be a beggar for the rest of their life. How are my grandchildren going to survive? And so I understand that that's the fear. But if the church is truly a partner in the gospel, then they would support their gospel workers appropriately. Yeah.
Talk to us about marriage and ministry as it relates to young Asian Australians or aspirational Asians who are thinking about going to ministry and might not yet be married, but as those 2 things kind of cross over at the same time. So in our church right now, we've got quite a few people who are thinking about ministry and also thinking about marriage. And sometimes they line up, but they don't always line up in the ways that they would hope. What's the experience been at Grace Point as you think about young people thinking about marriage and ministry?
I think for some people, if you ask me if the question was who I marry critical in ministry, my answer would be yes, because not everyone you marry is going to be able to have the emotional capacity to actually support you in the work of Christian ministry. And so the reality is that Christian ministry is hard. So anyone who actually says, come to Christian ministry because it's going to be easy, it's going to be a fun ride, is wrong. They have not read the New Testament. Colossians chapter 1, I think, we all know Colossians 1:28, those of us in pastoral ministry, because we know, the goal is to present people mature in Christ. But if you read the verses before that, Paul actually says, I rejoice in suffering in my service to the church. And no one ever tells you that. Or you read 2 Timothy chapter 1, where Paul actually says to Timothy, join with me in suffering for the cause of the gospel. And so I think who you choose to marry matters if you're going into Christian ministry, because they would actually need the resilience to support you and to walk with you in ministry that will not be easy, that will be hard. And so, who you marry actually matters. And I caution individuals who want to go into Christian ministry, men and women, because without a spouse that's going to support you, you would not be able to do long-term Christian ministry.
So you were talking about the 3 C's before. You've mentioned to us before that you have 2 other C's as well.
I do have 2 other C's. I think Cole Marshall is right. When we think of training people for ministry, we do want to grow them in character. Character is always king. We do want to grow them in conviction, so they need to grow in a knowledge of the Bible. Chris Chair, who's a senior minister of Adam Road Presbyterian Church, one of the most profound things he said to me that I'm incredibly thankful for. I remember sitting in a board meeting with him, and he actually said, we need, as we have this discussion, he said, we need God's word to show us God's way. And we must always do God's work God's way, and therefore we always need God's word. And this is in a board meeting, right? And so we do need to actually train and raise men and women who have a deep, clear knowledge of the Bible so they can actually think theologically about ministry. Then the third one is conviction, obviously. You need skills to do the work of ministry. But one of the things I've noticed is there are 2 other C's that we need to grow people in. We need to grow people in capacity. The nature of ministry has changed. It's not like, okay, I'm going to go into Christian ministry and I'm just going to be a preacher and teacher of the Bible and I don't have to worry about everything else. Well, that's not true. You guys in ministry, you know that if you're the lead of your ministries, it'd be nice just to sit all week and just read a commentary, read the Bible and prepare a sermon, but there's so many other things to do. There's pastoral care, there's people to call, people to care for, there's administration, there's crisis you deal with, there's long-term planning. So it requires a range of skills, and because there's a lot of pressure, it requires capacity. And so we need to grow people in capacity, or people need to, under God, humbly understand their level of capacity so that they know what they can and can't actually do in ministry. And so I think we need to grow people in capacity. So I think that's the 4th C. The 5th C, and I've seen this more, I suspect, as I've looked at people who are training for ministry and people in ministry, you got to grow people in courage. Because in ministry, you don't just face hardship, you make tough decisions. And the decisions you make actually do require courage. And you will only have that courage to make tough decisions and to do hard things and to love people well and sacrificially if you truly understand your identity, who you are in Christ, because there you will have security and that will give you courage. And so I do think there are 5 C's. I know others in Sydney have added other C's. I know, Iggy had mentioned before, chemistry, how you work in a ministry team. Bishop Gary Koo has said, another C that I think people in ministry need is charisma. They need to actually be able to work well with people, which could be similar to chemistry. But yeah, I think those additional 2 C's, capacity and courage, I think is what we look for and what we want to grow in people.
Do you think capacity is something that can be grown significantly? I can't say the word, sorry. Significantly in others? Or is it also part of looking for the right people and how God's made them?
I think you can always grow people in capacity. It's like, because I get asked this question, right? Frame it another way.
Yeah.
Can you actually go from being a mediocre preacher to a genius preacher, right? Or this is a big compliment to Sam Chan, right? Can you go from a mediocre preacher to being like Sam Chan, okay? Or David Cook, or Mike Rader? And the answer is, and I said this to students in class, no, you cannot go from a mediocre preacher to being a genius preacher. Because somewhere in that spectrum, there is a level of giftedness, correct? But you can go from a medium preacher, a mediocre preacher, to being a good preacher, an acceptable preacher, one who's preaching week in, week out, will feed the flock, who will grow the flock. You can. And that's what we need to work towards. It's the same with capacity. So I think you can grow someone who is low capacity to increasing the capacity, but whether you can grow them from being low capacity to being, the kind of pastor who can read like 10 books a week and who can churn out, journal article, produce 3 sermons, for the different sermons for the Sunday, and then meet 15 people in the week, sit on a board. Well, no, because at that point you're talking about genius level capacity, which many of us are just not there. Yeah.
Is there a threshold in terms of, you talk about low capacity, is there a threshold of capacity where you think actually below this, it actually may not be a good idea to go into gospel ministry?
I think this is the reason why those of young men and women who are thinking of Christian ministry, this is why working in some industry is a helpful thing before they go into ministry. Not because, they used to say, look, go out into the real world and find work so that you work out what the real world is like. Well, again, that's a nonsense, isn't it? Because those of us who are involved in the life of church, the church will know that the church is the real world. We see sinful people. We deal with brokenness. We deal with deceitfulness. We deal with sin, because the church is the place where God's people come in all their sinfulness, and where they're living in a community of brokenness and sinfulness, where mutual love and forgiveness has to be practiced under the Word of God. So the church is the real place. What's the value of sending someone into the workplace? Well, to help them grow in capacity, learning to manage life, learning to manage work, learning to relate to a range of people. So that's a life skill thing more than anything else. So that will actually show you whether someone has got capacity.
It's almost a bit like pre-ministry stress testing the
Correct.
system to see can you handle it.
That's right. That's why for me, and I said this to Adam, I said, when I see first, second year university students who are enthused about ministry, who are really involved in ministry, and people actually say to me, wow, these guys are on fire. I'm happy, I rejoice in that, right? But I'm also sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, I want to see what you're like in 5 and 10 years' time. Will you still have the capacity when you have a work? When you have sick parents, perhaps, that you've got to look after? When you have other stresses in life, will you still have the capacity? Will you still have that joy? Will you still be engaged and involved in the lives of people at church? And so I'm going, okay, first year enthusiasm, it's not tested. You gotta wait 5 years, 10 years, and then you'll see it. Yeah.
I don't know what it's like for you at your church, but we've got a lot of young guys who are keen on ministry, which is great, and they want to go straight, do a ministry traineeship after uni, which isn't necessarily in itself a bad thing. But sometimes I think to myself, just go get slaughtered at work for 2 years and let's see how you cope with that first. Yeah. And then that'll reveal the capacity constraints.
That's right.
Do you think we're representing well? So on the capacity and courage questions, when we encourage people into ministry, are we well and accurately representing the demands and costs of ministry so that people know what they're signing up for?
I don't think we do it well, because I think a lot of people don't see the breadth of ministry involved in leading a church or leading any ministry, because your only public ministry is really when you get up there to preach on Sunday, right? Isn't that all?
That's what pastors do.
That's what pastors do, right? They just preach one sermon a week.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, that's the myth, isn't it? But we all know that's not true. So unfortunately, that's the myth.
It's a great life, isn't it? 6 days invisible, 1 day incomprehensible.
Yes, that's right. That's right. One would hope for that. We're not incomprehensible on Sunday because we've had 6 days to work on that sermon.
If that's indeed what we've been doing.
Yeah, that's right.
When you talk about courage, ministry takes courage.
Yes, it does.
You planted a church.
Yeah.
Planting a church with not much money and not many people, that takes courage.
I don't know whether it was courage or it was naivety.
Well, lean into it, right?
Yeah, it was I think it was naivety, because I came home after meeting with a group of elders who wanted to plant a second generation ministry. They were starting the Chinese speaking ministry. I started the English speaking ministry. And I came home, and this is what you should not do. And I came home from the interview and I said to my wife, Pauline, I said, guess what we're doing next year? It was actually, I think it was October. I was supposed to do my 4th year at Moore, but it was in my 3rd year. I said to her, guess what we're doing next year? We're planting a church. So I'm not doing 4th year. And we hadn't really discussed it, right? And so I worked out as we were, we'd only been married for about 3 years then. I worked out, consult with your wife. It's good to actually pray about these things when you make decisions like planting a church. Yeah.
But you did?
Yes, we did.
You went ahead with it?
Yes, we did go ahead with it. Yeah.
And so when you think however many years on now, I'm curious, I always like to ask this question and think about it for myself starting out. What would you do differently?
Every church plant, I think, is different. I have never sought to reproduce our first plant at Grace Point. So in that sense, I wouldn't do anything differently because our vision and our mission remains. So we planted with a very clear theological vision and a theological mission to build God's people to reach God's will for God's glory. And that has not changed in 20 years. Now, obviously, we articulate things differently now, but in essence, that was it. And every subsequent plant we've landed, I think 5-6 years after the Burwood Evening Congregation, we planted the Granville Morning Congregation, which is now the Lidcombe Morning Congregation. It was the same vision, but it was different. Why? Because we had different kinds of people. So about 6 years in, we had families. So then you're planting with families, and families were different because families were their time poor, they've got other responsibilities. So it's different. So I don't think I would have done anything differently because the vision mission is different, but we did contextualize because the core team was different. Yeah.
So to what extent then, if the vision and the mission stayed the same, to what extent did culture have an impact on each of those different plants? Or to what extent did actually the cultural background of your congregation and your church shape the way in which you church planted?
From day one, we were always a church planting church. And we made that very clear, which means that every subsequent plant was never a surprise for the congregation. It also meant that people were willing to make those sacrifices. People were willing to actually be part of a core team, move into new congregations. But I think that's how the culture shapes a church planting movement within the church. So it's not a shock, It's like when you ask people, we want to start a new church here, a new congregation here in a different site, different geographical region. People are not thinking, why are we doing this? People are then thinking, should I be part of this new church community? Or if I'm not going, how can I support the planting of this new church community? So I think that culture has shaped Grace Point, and that's been a helpful thing.
So there's been a very strong church planting culture in the church from day one.
Yeah, we keep talking about it.
Yeah.
It might take 4 or 5 years before we do one.
Yeah.
But because we keep talking about it, it's always on the agenda.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think there's been any unique challenges in terms of planting with a demographic which is mainly Asian Australian that maybe Caucasian church plants don't have as much, just to think into it, or is it much of a muchness?
I'm convinced like attracts like. And so I think that's the reason why when we've landed congregations, new congregations, they tend to attract people who are like that congregation. And so if the face of the congregation is predominantly Australian Asian, that's what you tend to attract. I'm not saying you won't have others who are not Australian Asian, but that's what you tend to attract. I do notice we tend to attract people who are middle class because that's the cultural background. Even though the face might be Asian, that's the cultural background. More recently, though, I think we're moving into different areas of church planting. So, you guys are aware we've engaged Kamal Warakun. He's a Sri Lankan. So suddenly we've got a Sri Lankan on staff. And then we'll have Dinesh next year. He's an Indian. He'll be on staff. And we're actually hoping to land something in the Granville area, Granville Harris Park, which again is a different area. It's not a middle class area. It is being gentrified, probably be gentrified, more gentrified in the next decade. And so obviously once you have a different pastor on staff who reflects a different ethnicity, it will begin to actually, we believe, attract a different kind of face, as it were. But again, that's an experiment for us. We're stepping out and seeing what we can do in that space. Yeah.
That's an interesting comment, just to dig into the different faces on staff.
Yeah.
You want to speak into that a little bit more. So, as we think about reaching multicultural Australia, reaching Asians, can churches only do that well if they have someone of that ethnicity on staff?
No, I don't. I don't think it's not like you want to reach Asians, so you find an ABC to work on staff. I don't think it works that way. I think it's understanding the cultures we want to reach into, and being prepared to be all things to actually reach them. Now, being all things to reach them doesn't mean that we do an English service where we have 5 languages present and spoken in the service with a PowerPoint that has got like 5 languages on the screen. I think that's called confusion. That will only attract people who want to do services like that, and it will always be small. It will never grow. So I think what you need to do is to think about how do you just reach people in their different cultural groups, right? So I know a couple, amazing couple. They've been doing, they're Americans. They've been here for well over 3 decades. They've been doing ministry to Indian people in the Homebush area and Parramatta area, and they've been having a tremendous ministry with them. And that actually tells me that the color of your skin, it's not a barrier to you reaching across cultures. It isn't. It's whether you're prepared to actually cross those cultures, whether you're prepared to study and learn those cultures. It's whether you're prepared to contextualize, to reach those cultures. Yeah.
You made an observation before about like attracts like. I can imagine that different Christians and different gospel ministers would have different approaches and responses to that observation.
Absolutely.
So you could respond to it saying, like attracts like.
Yes.
That is a bad thing, and we want to push against that. You could say, we're going to acknowledge it as a reality, or we're going to lean in on it as a missional opportunity. What's your attitude towards
we
that
actually
statement?
do both, right? I don't think it's a negative thing. For us, it's leaning in and seizing it as a mission opportunity. Not actually saying, like attracts like, if you're not like us, you're not welcome. No, I think the gospel actually demands that we have to be welcoming to all people. And we got to embrace all people, right, across cultures. But we are not ashamed enough to say that we do have a unique culture in the life of our congregation, depending on our congregations. And so we're not trying to actually, I'll give you an example, right? The evening congregation, we've said in the evening congregation, this is a student congregation. So we will not have family ministry, Sunday school in the evening congregation. It's not that we don't love families, but we want to minister here to students as a mission strategy. And if you have families, we've got lots of other congregations at Grace Point that actually cater for families. But if you come to Grace Point and you want to come to the 4 o'clock slot, and you want the 4 o'clock slot to cater for your families, we'll say no, because this is a mission opportunity for us to reach students. So that's how we've actually operated in the life of our church. It's a mission strategy.
Is it unrealistic for churches to say, we want to be a Revelation 7 church, and to fully express that in our gathered congregation each Sunday?
Yeah, this is where Adam's really pushing me because he knows my views on this.
Views I share, don't worry.
Yeah, look, I don't know what it means. When people say we want to be a Revelation 7 church, what they actually mean is we want to be a church where we've got all the nations present, where we're all speaking our own language, where the sermon is basically in multi-language, and that's just confusing. It's just not helpful for the growth of the congregation. So I don't believe that's what a Revelation 7 church looks like. I think that is the eschatological reality to come, which we seek to reflect here. But it doesn't mean that in our present gatherings, we're going to have like 7, 8, 9, 10 languages, right? I don't think that's what it means. I do think we need to be embracing and reaching all people, but the gospel is communicated in culture, in a language. And it's got to be a language people understand. It's got to be in the heart language of the people. If I actually attempted to translate Cantonese, right, or even if someone translated me in Cantonese, there are still nuances that would appeal more to the English listener than the native Cantonese Hong Kong-born listener, right? That I can't accomplish. Whereas someone who can speak fluent Cantonese, raised in Hong Kong, who understands the idioms, the background of the people, would be much better communicating the gospel and growing them in the gospel than I would. And I want to recognize that.
So often we say that we're okay with the homogeneous unit principle, provided that it's confined to the sphere of language. But you're saying culture is a bit more expansive than that.
Absolutely. It's crazy, right? People come to our church and they say, you're all Chinese. And I say, well, I go to your church. You're all white. No. We have Asians in our church. How many? Okay, you have 100 people. You have 5 Asians. That doesn't make you a multi-ethnic church. That makes you like us. I have 180. I have 4 Caucasians. Does that make me a multi-ethnic church? Well, I want to argue that I am a multi-ethnic church, not because I have 4 Caucasians, because in my English congregation, I have Asian people from Cambodia, I have Asian people from Vietnam, I have Asian people from Singapore, I have Asian people from Malaysia, I've got Asian people from Taiwan, and they do come out of different cultural backgrounds, right? It's like you going to, it's funny, right? It's like it's going to, imagine going to a Caucasian church and saying, all of you are English. Well, if you have German people there, they'd be fairly offended. You got French people there, they're fairly offended because you don't put them all in the same basket, do you? Because even within a particular group of people, there is a diversity, there is a cultural difference.
So the risk is then you get almost a tokenistic multiculturalism that's skin deep.
Yes, that's right.
What do you think motivates that? I mean, I know we can't peer into our hearts or other people's hearts, and I can imagine there's a very well-intentioned motivation behind that. But what do you think drives that?
I think it's a failure to understand culture. I think it is. It's too simplistic to go, all Asian people are the same. It would also like me being simplistic and saying all white people are the same. Well, they're not, you know. And that's why I think there's diversity in our city. One of the retired ministers who serves with us, Pastor Joe Mock, this year and last year, he would go to a German church. I didn't even know German churches existed in our city. I'm staggered, right? German church. And who goes to a German church? Well, German-speaking people, right? And that's just the level of diversity in our city. They're white, but they're German. And I wouldn't want to call them French. That would upset them, wouldn't it? So why would you do the same when it comes to people of Asian background?
So how can church planting speak into this? Because we often say new churches reach new people. Can new churches reach new people groups?
I think they can reach new people groups, but you got to understand their background. Don't just look at the color of their skin. Look at their background. Look at their, you and I have talked, Adam and I have talked about this. Don't just look at the color of the skin. Look at their socioeconomic background. So because I think there's a lot more things in common with us, middle class, Asian Australian background. There's a lot more things in common with us and people who share that same background. And I think if you're moving into a suburb and a community, that's what you want to look at, not just the color of the skin, the socioeconomic background of the people that you're trying to reach. And in that sense, you do have a multi-ethnic church, you see, because you can actually have people who Indian descent, Chinese descent, but because they come out of the same socioeconomic background, there is you're pitching there. They might have different ethnicity, but they share the same struggles, which means that the gospel speaks to them in those struggles, even though they are ethnically different. Yeah.
Can I ask a question just about evangelism in churches more broadly? So churches which are predominantly white, Caucasian, Aussie churches, how much should they be pushing themselves to reach a group that doesn't look like them? If that is not their strength area, should they just be leaving that to the Asian churches? Well, is that a wise strategy to take?
If you lived in a suburb where there are no Asians, it would be silly for you to try to build a ministry in your church to reach Asian people or Indian people, right? So I've said to churches, look, you've got to look around at your community and work out who's actually in this community. Many years back, I did a consultation for a church in Sydney because the suburb was changing, and they were trying to work out what can we do to reach Asians in this community because the suburb's changing. And I said, look, before you even look at what your church might want to do to reach Asians, can I ask you a question? And so I said to the bunch of elders, do you know any Asians? And no one said anything. Okay, and I said, okay. Do you know any Asians on your street, right? Your neighbors? Well, and I said, well, that's where you should start. So if leadership in the church is not engaging people of other cultures where they are at, you will never see them in the life of the church, right? So take the suburb of Wahroonga in Sydney, right? Predominantly white. If Wahroonga wants to start a mission reaching subcontinentals, I'll go, why? Why do you want to reach subcontinentals? I know you want to reach the nations, but you're better off trying to work out who are the nations in our suburb? Who are the people in our suburb? And that's where you should start. Who are my neighbors? And I think that churches actually fail to actually do that. Yeah. So great ambition, but they haven't looked at the context in which they live. Yeah.
That's great advice. Yeah. It's huge.
I remember one church asking me, how can we get the Asians to come to us?
Yes.
Why aren't they coming?
Oh, yeah, I've heard that one
And
too.
I thought to myself, well, why don't you go to them?
Yes,
Well,
that's right. Absolutely.
Let me pitch an observation that my former pastor made to me, and I'm keen to hear what you think about it. He said at the church that I was previously at before we planted, he said each year, for every 10 mainland Chinese people that come to faith, one Caucasian comes to faith.
Yeah.
But the effort that it takes to convert that one Caucasian is 10 times the amount that it takes for the 10 Chinese people to come to faith. Why do you think that is?
This is an interesting one because I think we've had a chat with our missions pastor. Kamal is actually our missions pastor. And he makes this very useful distinction, right? And I don't just think it's true of Sydney. I think it's true of Melbourne. And it might also be true of our other cities. He said, when you look at our city, he says, you've got non-religious, secular people. But then when you look at our city, in some suburbs, you have religious unbelievers. And you've got to work out where do people fall. Now, I actually think migrant families, Asians, they fall within the religious unbelievers category. There's still a sense of the transcendent. There is still I think there is a God. I believe in a morality. And so you're not really dealing with secular. You're dealing with religious unbelievers as opposed to secular unbelievers. And that depends on where you live in our city. So, which is why I suspect most Caucasians are secular unbelievers. And so the type of evangelism I suspect we do is going to have to be different. New York City style Keller type engagement intellectually. But when you deal with religious unbelievers, because it could be because they've been raised in religious families, so they've got exposure to the Christian faith, maybe because they're religious because they come out of a Hindu background, a Buddhist background, they believe in a sense of a transcendent. We're dealing with religious people. So in a place like Granville, it's interesting because Kamal's doing that work. He said to me, when you speak to religious unbelievers, you don't have to convince them that there is a right or wrong, or a truth, or morality. Evangelism is different, right? You don't have to tell them that there is such a thing called sin, because they believe, yes, there is a sin, right? Just that they don't believe that Jesus is the solution, right? Or they don't know that Jesus is the solution. Whereas you're dealing with secular unbelievers, and there's no truth. So the evangelism is different because where we start from in terms of engaging them, the assumptions are different.
Yeah, I don't want to make a massive generalization here, but we've tended to find with our evangelism that when we're reaching Asian Australians, the place of evidentialist apologetics is just not as significant there.
Yes.
Because there are fewer apologetic objections to the gospel.
Yes, that's right.
They're not hostile. They're actually reasonably empathetic.
Yes, that's right.
And sympathetic. Yeah. But it's just a matter of presenting the gospel to them in a way that they understand. Whereas when we've had Anglo friends visit us, they are starting quite from a different starting point.
That's right. That's right. So it's very different in that sense. Yeah.
Do we then need to have different evangelistic strategies based on who we want to reach? I mean, that presumes that we actually know who we want to reach.
Yeah, I think we do. I think we do. And, Kamal, who's been with us for a year, made the observation coming to Grace Point that most of our type of evangelism at Grace Point, because our church is a place in Burwood, because it's middle class, people's friends are more secular, tends to lead more towards, we speak more in terms of reaching secular unbelievers. And our preaching style tends to lend towards that. And he's remarked that should we start doing work in the Granville area, reaching different kinds of people, the way we speak and the way we do our apologetics and evangelism, he says that would have to change. Yeah.
What final advice would you have for churches that feel like they're not reaching cross-culturally enough, but they want to? They have a genuine gospel heart to reach the nations and the nations around them, but they just don't know where to start with that.
I think you start where you are. Start with your neighbors. I think that's the advice I've always given people. Who lives next door to you? I think when I've thought of evangelism, I've never thought of who are the ethnic people I want to reach, because that's kind of bizarre, right? It's like, who are the ethnic people I want to reach now? And even with my kids, right? It's not like I say to them, we got to be reaching the nations. Who are the ethnic peoples that you should be reaching? No. I don't think that works that way. It's who are the people around you that you know? Who are the people around you that you rub shoulders with? And so this is what we say at church, right? Look at your footprints during the week. Where are you most during the week? If you're a university student, if you're a worker, and where you leave your footprints during the week, that is your mission field. So who are the people there, where you leave your footprints during the week? And I think that's where evangelism starts. So before we even think of programs, we've got to work out, or even before we think of reaching the nations, reach people around you. That's it, right? So I think it's crazy. Sometimes, we want to reach the nations, and we can't even speak to our neighbor, which is nuts, right? Why do you want to do that for, So you want to be a multi-ethnic church? Well, that'll look after itself. Reach people around you. Look at where you leave your footprints during the week and who you rub shoulders with, and seek to reach them. Pray for them and seek to reach them. That's what I would say.
Thanks so much for that, Euge.
Pleasure.
You've been listening to a Reach Australia podcast on cross-cultural ministry, and we've been joined today by Eugene Hor, the lead pastor of Grace Point Presbyterian Church. Reach Australia wants to see thousands of healthy, evangelistic and multiplying churches right across our country, and you can find out more at reachaustralia.com.au.